So good evening, and thank you for joining us for the third and final conversation of this series on the search for democracy in Ethiopia. We learned so much from the first and second week's discussions and look forward to learning more this evening. My name is Mark Campbell. I'm a director of Democracy House and will be your MC this evening. I'd like you to know that while I've got the easy job of introducing this evening's events, there are other Democracy House directors working hard behind the scenes to bring this important series to you, and I'd like to acknowledge them. Darla Campbell has been managing the Zoom controls for the last couple of meetings, and Lyle Shipley has been managing the registration and a whole host of things behind the scenes that we only recently became aware of. So please say hi to them. They've been doing a great job. They're working hard to make the evening flow smoothly, but I know they would love to engage with you personally. They will join us after the official part of the evening and look forward to meeting some of you then. Darla and Lyle, thank you so much. They are part of Democracy House, directors of Democracy House. There are a couple of others. And we together have decided that this would be a non-partisan, multi-partisan grassroots movement dedicated to restoring respectful engagement as the foundation of thriving democracy systems. And I just lost my cheat sheet. Hang on a second here. There we go. So our guiding principles are trust and respect, inclusion and diversity, honesty and transparency, openness, and engagement. We focus on activities, events like this, education, and advocacy. I'm sure tonight's conversation will be passionate and thought-provoking. For your benefit, to get the most benefit from this conversation, I'd like to outline how the evening ought to proceed. I will introduce our moderator, who will take you through the Democracy House rules of engagement. He will then introduce tonight's guest speaker, who I understand has an enthusiastic following in the Ethiopian diaspora. Our guest speaker will give thoughts on the Ethiopian election and democratic legitimacy, followed by a Q&A session with our moderator for about 10 minutes. You're invited to ask questions in the chat box or to raise your hand. There's also a little digital thing in the Zoom link that you can raise your hand there. We'll then break out into separate breakout rooms of 3 to 5 people. You'll introduce yourselves briefly, then discuss some questions that arise from the talk. We'll post those questions that you might want to consider in the chat box. Other than that, we just hope the conversation will just flow naturally from the people in the room. We'll return to the main room for a minute to check in and reshuffle so you can join others in a different breakout room with another group of 3 to 5. We'll close the official portion of this evening's event a few minutes before 8:30. For those of you who'd like to stay and mingle afterward, we'll stay open till 9. This portion of the evening has been great fun, and we look forward to chatting with you individually then. The Democracy House movement was conceived in Toronto, the world's first 50-50 city. This means that when you meet someone here, chances are 50-50 that they will not even have been born in Canada. Beautiful thing about living here in Toronto is that your friends, neighbors, people you meet daily can be from just about anywhere in the world. And we love that. A year ago on Canada Day, I went for a walk in High Park with some neighbors and met Legitimacy, who told us that on Canada Day 5 years ago, he became a Canadian citizen. He expressed then how happy and thankful he is to be here. Since then, I've learned more about my friend and neighbor Gazan. He graduated from the Addis Ababa University, a new generation university college in global studies, international relations, and literature. In Ethiopia, he worked at various print and broadcast media outlets and went on to establish 3 radio shows on literature and a TV show on urbanization. I'd love to hear more about that. These were forced to close by the Ethiopian government, and the result, exile in Canada. Toronto is now fortunate to have Gazan and his small family living amongst us. Gazan remains highly engaged with the Ethiopian diaspora through his New Perspectives journal and Addisቅኝት radio programs focused on human rights. Having engaged in Democracy House conversations in February, Ghazan asked if we might help him to organize this series about democracy in Ethiopia prior to elections this year. And here we are this evening to discuss Ethiopian election and democratic legitimacy. Ghazan, my friend, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your kind introduction, and welcome everybody. Tonight's conversation would be the last one, and it would be more interesting, hopefully. As Mark put it clearly, this is a collaborative event between Democracy House and New Perspective, Aዲስቅኝት Ethiopian media. This collaboration is very symbolic for me and for the Ethiopian community in Toronto and in the GTA. Because it's a people-to-people engagement between Canada and Ethiopia. I would like to thank all the organizers and participants of this event. As we discussed, the election day is approaching, and Ethiopia is scheduled to have the national election on the June the 14th. This year election is the 6th one after the Ethiopia fall under the rule of ethnic federalism since the end of Cold War. The 6th Ethiopian national election will be happening amid a war, a pandemic, and a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the election in particular and the country in general. Talking about misinformation and disinformation, for instance, at the beginning of this week, one social media outlet disseminated an information, the truth of which was declined by the Prime Minister's office later date. In the fake audio recording, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was saying he will rule the country for the coming 10 years, and he already won the election. This kind of misinformation will have a negative impact on the election process. From the previous experience, disputes are common. After the election, if disputes arise, what could be the solution? According to the Ethiopian 2021 elections rules, actors, and mechanisms document, the National Election Board of Ethiopia approved the registration of 51 political parties under the electoral law for the upcoming election. According to the rules, after the election, if dispute arises, there is a joint forum of political parties. The joint forum of political parties is an ad hoc to be organized by National Election Board of Ethiopia to resolve election dispute between political parties at polling stations and constituencies based on dialogue and negotiation. The joint forum operates based on the concept of all political parties to disputes of all political parties. Today's conversation title is The Ethiopian Election and Democratic Legitimacy. Our guest speaker is Petros Woldeyohannes. Tonight, Petros will remind us that democracy is the sum of its process and systems, but most importantly, that its legitimacy hinges on confidence from the people. In this conversation, you will explore what to expect from the election in Ethiopia, June 14, and whether the people and rival parties will or will not accept the legitimacy of the outcome by considering different questions that you will have later on. With this, I would like to introduce you to tonight's keynote speaker, Petros Woldeyohannes. Petros Woldeyohannes is the owner of Hamlet Arts Production, an author, director, and screenplay writer. His current project is a serial drama exploring critical social issues in Ethiopia, such as the widespread corruption and environmental damage exacerbated by Western interests. His past works include his book, Abol, Hilmina Onet, Dreams and Realities, 2 short documentaries, The Truth Matters, The Quest for Survival, Dirt, and the feature film, 2 Worlds, Bloodbound. Petros is on the board of Addis-Nagat Arts Forum and is the Toronto chapter secretary and the national PR team member with Ethio-Canadian Network for Advocacy and Support, ICNAS, where he is very active and advancing Ethiopia's interests and bringing voices to the voiceless. Thank you for your attention, and Petros, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Gazahin. Can you hear me? Is my voice clear?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Thank you again for your very, very generous introduction. I'm truly grateful and feel privileged to get this platform to share my perspective on the prospects of Ethiopia's upcoming election. Now, when my friend Gazahin asked me to take part in this conversation, and when he told me I will be sharing a platform with the likes of Jeremy Kinsman, a distinguished career diplomat, and Obang Metho, a giant of human rights activism, my first instinct was to say no. But I realized democracy is about giving voice to ordinary citizens like myself. And more importantly, as a board member and secretary of ICNAS, which is an Ethio-Canadian network for advocacy and support, I decided I shouldn't shy away from taking part in this dialogue. So please do not take my brief presentation as an expert analysis or as a groundbreaking insight into Ethiopia's election. Rather, as a perspective of an ordinary citizen who is gravely concerned about the present and future of Ethiopia, like millions of Ethiopians, and like many of you here in attendance today. Now, having said that, as we are anxiously waiting for the upcoming election in Ethiopia, I would try to briefly set the context in which this election and Ethiopia's attempt to transition to democracy is taking place. Because it's the context on the ground that determines the confidence that people have on the election, and as a result, the very legitimacy of the government. We can view these driving factors in 5 categories. The first important context or factor in this election is the fact that the governing party is undergoing a transition from a coalition of unequal ethno-nationalist parties into a single national party. On paper, this transition has already occurred, but in reality, there is an internal struggle, an internal battle going on between the extreme ethno-nationalist core of the party and the reformist wing of the party led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. So the extreme nationalist forces appear to dominate the political landscape, especially in the Oromia region, from local level all the way to the leaders of the regional state, which happens to be the largest province in Ethiopia. Now, this extreme ethno-nationalism combined with the absence of strong institutions of democracy and the absence of accountability has led to widespread communal violence in Ethiopia. And the governing party has not been able to contain this ethnic violence. And this has clearly impacted people's confidence in the government in general and in the election process in particular. In addition, these ethno-nationalist elements of the governing party have continued the repressive and authoritarian ways of the past, making political campaigns by opposition parties very difficult in many parts of Oromia region, which again is the largest province in the country. So it is clear that this election is taking place not in an ideal condition. Regardless of these obstacles, though, I believe the outcome of this election, if concluded relatively peacefully and with the acceptance of large enough stakeholders, will help the reformist wing of the government and the moderate oppositions to consolidate political power and stabilize the unrest in the country. That, in my opinion, is the best case scenario. The second critical factor is the legacy of ethnic federalism and the polarization that it has created in Ethiopia. For 27 years, the EPRDF government, which was dominated by TPLF, has constitutionalized and institutionalized ethnic-based politics and ethnic federalism, which was essentially copied and pasted from Stalin's Soviet Union. Using that system, they pushed a narrative that grossly distorted our history as only a history of ethnic oppression and animosity, nothing else. Mallas Zenawi, the former prime minister and architect of the ethnic federalism, famously stated, "The Aksum obelisk is nothing for someone from Walaita." Imagine an Italian prime minister saying the Colosseum is nothing for a Sicilian or a Lombard. So, I mean, TPLF did everything it can to destroy the national cohesion and integration among Ethiopians of diverse ethnic and religious background. And that was done simply as part of its strategy to divide and rule Ethiopians for long. Now, in a country like Ethiopia, where socio-cultural ecology is highly intermingled and where there are overlapping ethnic identities with significant movement of people, intermingling of communities, implementing pure ethnic federalism had created a condition where TPLF and affiliated ethnic elites exploited real or perceived historic grievances to acquire political and economic hegemony. They maintained this absolute dominance for almost 3 decades by exacerbating, institutionalized and enhanced divisions and tensions among ethnic groups, especially the Amara and the Oromo. Because this process happened in the absence of strong democratic institutions and at the age of social media, it has led to unsustainable political polarization. So it is under this unhealthy condition, unhealthy inherited condition, where political issues are mostly viewed through the lens of polarized ethnic lens, that we are holding an election in Ethiopia today. One can imagine then the impact of such condition on the confidence of people in the election and the very legitimacy of their government. I mean, the impact of political polarization in people's confidence can even be seen in well-established democracies. For example, if we take our southern neighbor, the US, white nationalists still believe the last presidential election is stolen. If a country that has, that is considered the icon of democracy and has built institutions of democracy for over 200 years, if such country can have a crisis of confidence in its elections and in institutions, then imagine the challenges that institutionally implemented authoritarian ethnic federalism presents in Ethiopia in terms of legitimacy and election outcomes. That's why I personally believe that the reformist wing of the government in Ethiopia and modern, moderate non-ethnic opposition forces deserve our support and the support of international community, because they are operating under very challenging conditions on the ground. Now, before I move on to the next important point, I would like to briefly address the most common argument that we hear even from our well-meaning Canadian and American friends about Ethiopia's ethnic federalism, because I think that's really important, both in the context of this election and in Ethiopia's democratization. Now, the argument goes in multi-ethnic society, cultural and language rights or historic grievances can only be addressed through ethnic federalism in order to avoid continued marginalization and exclusion. I heard different versions of this argument even during our conversation last week. Now, I would ask our Canadian friends, if political mobilization based on ethnicity is the recipe for political inclusion and building a foundation for legitimacy, why doesn't Canada have First Nations Liberation Front as a political party? Or why doesn't the USA have Black People's Liberation Front? After all, these are people whose fathers were enslaved, lynched, and treated as subhumans for several decades. And it's only after 1967 that interracial marriages were fully legal in the United States. So grievances between the Amara and the Oromo, or the Amara and the Tigray in Ethiopia, pale in comparison to the injustice and exclusion endured by African Americans in USA. Yet we don't have Black People's Political Party. Or why doesn't multi-ethnic societies such as Switzerland have no ethnic political parties, or federalism that is exclusively based on ethnic identity? The answer is very simple. Ethnic federalism is both logically fallacious and practically disastrous. Intellectually, a person always has multiple overlapping identities, such as gender, sexual orientation, religion, class, education, physical ability, and so on. I am male, I'm a Christian, I'm middle class, I am a university graduate, I'm a feminist, I'm socially liberal, I'm fiscally moderate, and so on. So the idea that only my ethnic identity should form the basis to who I am, and as a result should exclusively shape my political views, is intellectually illogical. My position on, say, the healthcare system in Ethiopia, or on employment, or the economy, on land tenure, on a range of important issues, is shaped by numerous factors that determine who I am as a person. And since political systems govern all important aspects of our communal lives within a country, a system that excludes all these important factors or parts of our identity and force us to view everything through an ethnic lens makes absolutely no logical sense. I just wanted to add this point for the benefit of our non-Ethiopian friends who are sometimes eager to prescribe such a system to us while never adopting it themselves. Now, I also said pure ethnic federalism is impractical. This is evident in the failure of the boundaries of Ethiopia's regional states that were supposed to correspond with ethnicity, but they don't. Why? Because people are not herds that live in isolation. Communities have intermingled and moved in all directions for centuries, resulting in overlapping ethnic identities. Yet, we have implemented this pure ethnic federalism, granting regional states to larger ethnic groups like the Amara, the Oromo, and the Tigray, even though there are millions of people belonging to different ethnic groups living in these states, and millions that have mixed heritage like myself. These created minority ethnic groups that are marginalized because they are outnumbered in a political system that exclusively mobilizes along ethnic lines. And strangely, multiple smaller ethnic groups were also lumped together to form other states like the Southern Regional State and the Benshangul Gumuz State. In all these cases, the result is endless cycle of tensions and violence among ethnic groups that happen to live in the same or neighboring regions, competing for resources and political power. So it is within this illogical, impractical, and polarizing system of ethnic federalism that this election is taking place. One can imagine then how difficult it is to untangle the political debates from narrow ethno-nationalist perspective to broader issues. Again, that's why the reform efforts to move away from such shallow and divisive politics should be supported, in my view. The third important factor that affects people's confidence in this election is the weakness of Ethiopia's democratic institutions. Unfortunately, the authoritarian culture of EPRDF is still prevalent, especially in the regional special forces and in police forces and so on. These forces are, for the most part, products of 3 decades of ethnic indoctrination. As such, many of them tend to be loyal to their ethnic group as opposed to the rule of law. That's why so many of the ethnic violence against minorities continued, because the perpetrators happen to be from the same ethnic group as these forces. I must add, it's not all gloom and doom. There have been commendable reforms, for example, in the federal armed and police forces. They appear to be on a good trajectory to be truly national and independent institutions. There is also a very impressive transformation of the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia. It's currently led by a former opposition leader and political prisoner, Birtukan Mediksa. Given the complex challenges of our politics, I think the Electoral Board is doing a good job. And the same goes for the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which has produced a number of reports on communal violence, jailing of politicians, prison conditions, and so on. So these are very encouraging beginnings of democratization that will help build people's confidence. Another important element that affects public confidence and government's legitimacy is the media. On one hand, it is for the first time in our history that we are enjoying extensive press freedom. On the other hand, because the media is dominated by political elites, it tends to reflect and reinforce the polarized politics on the ground. And then we have the dominance of social media that is not controlled by traditional editorial restraints. That, I believe, is polarizing our politics even more, because extremists from any corner on our planet have easy and instantaneous access to spread their hateful messages. The violence that cost so many lives following Jawar Mohammed's Facebook post is a prime example of the challenges social media presents to our politics today. So sensationalization by social media and its focus on wage issues make substantive debates on important policy issues very difficult, further damaging public confidence in the election process. And then we have the conflict in Tigray, which is an important factor in our election. This conflict, which the international community mysteriously avoids to acknowledge that it was started by TPLF's attack on the National Army base, has a significant impact in our election. On one hand, the conflict has generated enormous political pressure from the international community on the Ethiopian government. But on the other hand, it has actually helped the ruling government to garner support internally, at least from those that were satisfied rather that were unhappy with the government's inability to stop the communal violence in Oromia and Benshangul Gumuz region. But I think the existential threat that TPLF pose has made it more likely for some opposition groups and their supporters to readily accept the election results, even if the playing field is far from even. I think the Tigray conflict has also helped mitigate the challenges Oromo opposition parties pose. Since the conflict is dominating the airwaves, it has taken the political oxygen away from opposition Oromo activists and political leaders, dwarfing their protests. It has also given the ruling party a political cover to ignore the repressive conditions and widespread corruption in Oromia region. Lastly, the new Sudan and Egypt axis that is trying to impede the Great Renaissance Dam project on the Blue Nile is also a factor in this election. On one hand, the mega project, which has the potential to transform our economy and change the lives of millions of Ethiopians, it has a broad-based support in Ethiopia. And as such, it helps the government politically. On the other hand, it seems like Egypt is supporting and using TPLF and OLF Shane to wage a proxy war in Ethiopia in an effort to weaken the government. So if the security situation improves or remains more or less the same in the coming couple of weeks, then politically the government will benefit. But if, for instance, OLF Shane manages to carry out violent attacks against innocent civilians, then that may change the political calculus for some opposition parties and their supporters, as a result, potentially eroding people's confidence in the election outcome. I think these are the main drivers of the electorate's confidence in the upcoming election. And thank you very much again. And I look forward to hearing your perspectives. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Petros. Fascinating talk. We're learning more and more. And I know that Ghazan will have some questions to ask you. And I, again, ask anybody who would like to ask a question, please pop it into the chat box and please take it away, Ghazan, with Petros.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Petros, for your presentation. And I have some questions. I think our time is up. We have to go to the breakout rooms and we'll continue our conversation there. But one question I have for you is, some people believe that it's very naive to expect a different outcome playing with the same existing rules and the constitution that gives legal ground for the ethnic politics in today's Ethiopia. And how do you be optimistic about the outcome of the election considering this issue?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that very interesting question. I think my optimism stems from the fact that democracy is a process. And we're not going to be able to leapfrog from tyranny to perfectly functioning, mature democracy overnight. So as long as we have that in mind, and we are going in the right direction by strengthening our institutions, like the example I gave with the Electoral Board and the Human Rights Commission and so on. These are baby steps that we need to take in order to move towards a mature democracy. But in terms of the underlying condition, like the ethnic federalism system we have and so on, I understand some people want to make legal changes overnight, but sometimes, you cannot really change people's hearts by judicial decrees. Yes, in some instances, it can help to restrain extreme forces making regulatory changes. However, there needs to be a parallel process in place, a process to find large enough support on the ground, critical mass on the ground, to be able to implement those legal changes that we are looking forward. And the responsibility is not just on the government, it's also on the media, on civic organizations, religious organizations, and so forth. It takes all our efforts to be able to move towards that goal of democratization. So my optimism is on the process, not on the immediate outcome of the upcoming election. Thank you.